Let's set our fantasy football lineups. This is week 5, matchups that matter. We are going to be breaking down everything that you guys need to know to set the best fantasy football lineup you can, from over-unders to implied point totals to shadow coverage matchups, good matchups for wide receivers, bad matchups for running backs. Everything will be covered in today's video. So if you enjoy, leave a like, subscribe if you're new around here. Now let's get into it. All right, so now that we are in week 5, it is officially time for bye week. So Cleveland Browns, Los Angeles Chargers, Seattle Seahawks, and Tampa Bay Buccaneers, all teams that are on bye this week. You cannot use their players, obviously, so we will have to dig a little bit deeper for those flex decisions. Maybe have to stream a quarterback this week. Maybe have to stream a tight end this week. So I'll have you covered throughout this video. But let's kick things off with the highest over-unders of the slate. You guys can see them in order there, and I did a good job, I think, of simplifying these tables so that they're easier to understand. The left-hand team is the home team. The middle team is the away team. So Vikings, Chiefs, Rams, Eagles, Buffalo Bills, Jacksonville Jaguars, and London, Miami Dolphins, New York Giants, and then San Francisco 49ers and Dallas Cowboys have the highest over-unders on the slate. So if you have any Vikings, if you have any Chiefs, if you have any Rams, if you have any Eagles, you definitely want to fire those guys up. Use those as tiebreakers if you can, so that I have a guy that's in a high-scoring game environment. Maybe I want to go with him over the guy that's maybe in one of these categories: the Pittsburgh Steelers, Baltimore Ravens, Patriots, Saints, Falcons, Texans, Colts, Titans, Broncos, Jets. These guys are in very low-scoring game environments. A 38-point over-under, 40-point over-under, 41.5, 43, and 43.5-point over-under, respectively. So, again, take out a piece of paper, take out a pen, and start scheduling your start-sit decisions. Who's got a good matchup, who's got, a high over-under, who's got a low over-under, and definitely use that to make decisions. Use them as tiebreakers for your start-sit decisions. So when we get into the implied point totals, and of course these usually overlap with high over-under games, and they're always going to be generally good teams that you're starting players from anyway. But if you do have a lineup decision that involves the Miami Dolphins, Kansas City Chiefs, Philadelphia Eagles, Detroit Lions, or Buffalo Bills, you probably want to lean with players from those teams. So, for example, if you have Gabriel Davis, who plays for the Bills, who are implied for 27 points, going up against Cortland Sutton as your flex decision, maybe you want to roll with Gabriel Davis, given the high implied point total there. And as far as the low implied point totals, the Pittsburgh Steelers, Carolina Panthers, New York Giants, not in very good situations from an implied point perspective there. Next, we get into where the sharps are betting. Of course, Vegas is not always right. The over-unders and, where the money is going is also very, very indicative of what games could overperform expectations, what games could underperform expectations. So the Denver Broncos and New York Jets game is getting 98% of the steam right now on the over of 43.5. That Vikings-Chiefs game that's already expected to be high scoring, catching some steam on the over. Same goes for Rams, Eagles, Dolphins, Giants. And then the Sunday night game, the Raiders and Packers, also expected to go over. And then some of the games catching a lot of steam on the under. We have the Pittsburgh Steelers and Baltimore Ravens, which is already a very low total to begin with, catching a lot of steam on the under there. The New England Patriots and New Orleans Saints, also a low total to begin with, catching a lot of steam on the under. Same goes for the Falcons and Texans. And then that Cardinals-Bengals game looks like a bet against the Bengals offense figuring their shit out. That game is catching a lot of steam on the under. And then same goes for that 49ers-Cowboys game. Of course, we know both defenses are quite strong, so that is probably why that game is catching some steam on the under. And then we'll get into the advanced data points. So these are things like pace of play, offensive DVOA versus the opponent's defensive DVOA. Again, I'll try and simplify the charts a little bit so it makes it a little bit more easy to understand. Basically, what we're looking for here with the fastest paced games is how fast are each offense operating, and that is going to lend itself to more offensive plays being run. So the New England Patriots and New Orleans Saints, both up-tempo type of offenses, they are expected to combine for the shortest pace of play, aka they're going to probably run a lot of plays in that game, so maybe that 40-point over-under is a little bit of a fugaz there. 49ers and Cowboys, also fast-paced games, so on and so forth. And then in terms of the slower-paced games, we have the Broncos, Jets, Commanders, and Bears tonight. Raiders and Packers on Sunday night, Lions and Panthers there as well, and then the London game, Jaguars and Bills, also expected to be a little bit slower pace, so keep an eye on the pace of play of those games, maybe use that as a potential tiebreaker as well. And then when we have the offensive DVOA versus the defensive DVOA, you guys can see that the biggest matchup advantage goes to the Miami Dolphins offense versus the New York Giants defense for an advantage of 58.49%. The Lions versus the Panthers, also a high percentage advantage as well, Eagles versus Rams. Little surprising. We see the Cardinals with a big-time advantage over the Bengals defense because the Cardinals offense has been surprisingly good. Bengals defense been surprisingly bad. And then the Buffalo Bills, who have been on a tear on offense recently, versus the Jaguars defense, which is pretty stingy, but the Bills should be able to beat them there. And then some of the biggest disadvantages, again, you probably want to leave some of these players on your bench, goes to the Steelers versus the Ravens defense, the Panthers versus the Lions defense, Rams versus the Eagles defense, Jaguars versus the Bills defense, and then Bears tonight versus the Commanders defense. Again, keep all of this in mind when you're making your start-sit decisions. We want offenses that are set up to score points, point blank period. The shadow coverage matchups. So when we have our fantasy wide receivers, typically we want them going up against weak secondaries, not against number one shadow lockdown type of corners. Some of the downgrades this week you guys can see on the screen there. The Falcons wide receivers and tight end, Drake London and Kyle Pitts going up against the Texans secondary. It's been pretty strong this season, even without Derek Stingley the last game or two. And then the Denver Broncos wide receivers going up against the Jets secondary. Of course, we know that Sauce Gardner and DJ Reed and those guys can kind of lock it down. We do have a couple like raw shadow matchups with Garrett Wilson versus Pat Surtain, Devontae Adams versus Jair Alexander, who of course would have practiced against each other very often when they both played for the Packers, and then Justin Jefferson versus L'Jarius Sneed. I have these listed here as yellow matchups because all three of those wide receivers are good enough to beat those corners, and we've seen a little bit of up and down play from those corners as well to indicate that those guys should be just fine. The one I worry most about is Justin Jefferson, just because L'Jarius Sneed has been the best of those three corners, but Justin Jefferson is obviously the best receiver in fantasy, so I'm not overly concerned about him. And then as far as the matchups that are good, so positive news for our fantasy wide receivers, we have the Colts wide receivers, Pittman and Downs, Zay Flowers and OBJ, and then the Chiefs wide receivers, I suppose if you're really desperate, with a lot of bye week guys, maybe you have Keenan Allen on bye or something like that, and you could pick up a Marquez Valdez-Scantling, a Sky Moore, a Rashee Rice off of waivers, or maybe they're on your bench right now. They could be in a good spot here against the Minnesota Vikings secondary, which is expected to be a high-scoring game, as I mentioned. Now let's get into the actual quarterback matchups and running back matchups and wide receiver matchups and tight end matchups here. The quarterback position, again, the far left column indicates which quarterback we're talking about. The second from left column indicates their opponent, and all of the metrics in terms of weighted average against quarterbacks are based off of their opponent. So the best matchups you guys can see there, Patrick Mahomes, Tua Tagovailoa, and Anthony Richardson, most notably, are fantasy relevant quarterbacks that you're going to want to have in your lineup. All three of those guys are inside my top 6 overall quarterbacks on the week, and I definitely want them in my lineup this week. Decent streamer that we have tonight with Sam Howell going up against the Chicago Bears. If you guys have Deshaun Watson or Justin Herbert on bye and Sam Howell's available on your waiver wire, he is a very, very solid option to throw right into your lineup on Thursday Night Football and use him tonight. If you guys are psychotic enough to start Zach Wilson, he's in a good spot this week, and he did look better last Sunday night against the Chiefs. Bad matchups, though, for Brock Purdy, for Trevor Lawrence, for Jared Goff. Temper expectations for those guys, although all three are still inside my top 15 quarterbacks. So if you need to start them, I don't think you should bench them necessarily. But if you have a really good option as a backup, then maybe you do bench those guys and then sit Derek Carr and sit whoever starts at quarterback for the Pittsburgh Steelers, whether it's Kenny Pickett or Mitch Trubisky. Those guys don't touch your lineup. Running back matchups, you guys can see them on the screen there. A lot of good smash spots for a lot of good fantasy running backs. Namely, we have Bijan Robinson in a really good spot. We have Saquon Barkley, assuming he's back, in a really good spot. We have Joe Mixon in a really good spot. We have Brian Robinson tonight in a really good spot against the Bears. And then also we have Breece Hall, who is expected to see an increased workload, according to head coach Robert Saleh, said he's no longer on a pitch count. He's in a really good spot going up against the Denver Broncos defense that, I mean, we know what happened to them 2 weeks ago against the Dolphins. And even last week, they suffered quite a bit against the run as well. CMC, James Cook, DeAndre Swift, and Kyron Williams, all of those guys have tough matchups this week, but they're still in your fantasy lineups regardless. I still have all 4 of those guys inside my top 13 to 15 overall running backs. And then Alexander Mattison is the only other guy here that is not rated that high for me, but even though it's a bad matchup against the Chiefs, we do have, like I said, a 52.5 point over-under game environment there for Kansas City and for Minnesota, so you definitely want to have Mattison in your lineup just on the off chance that he finds the end zone. We'll see what happens with Akers kind of working back into the fold now since they traded for him, but I still think that Mattison is a fine start this week. Then we get into the wide receiver matchups, and you guys can see them on the screen there. We have Michael Pittman Jr., Garrett Wilson, CeeDee Lamb, Zay Flowers, and DeAndre Hopkins. If you guys have any of those players on your fantasy teams, All of them are in good matchups this week. All of them are in good spots to put up fantasy points. Some flex options for these teams, if you guys don't have those like number one receivers, the guys that could be viable because they're in good matchups from the teams that I just mentioned. We have Brandon Cooks and Michael Gallup. If you guys are have a player on bye, maybe those guys are viable pickups. Josh Downs for the Indianapolis Colts has had pretty good usage so far, and he has, like I said, a very good matchup against the Tennessee Titans. They've been like dead last to opposing wide receivers in the NFL. And then if you're really desperate, let's say you have Keenan Allen and Amari Cooper on bye, and you just have to piece together a starting lineup, I think you could do worse than Allen Lazard this week going up against the Broncos. He's probably available on your waiver wire for the most part, and I do think, knowing that Surtain is going to be on Garrett Wilson, we could see a lot of usage there for Allen Lazard for the New York Jets. And then the guys that don't have good matchups, temper expectations for Brandon Ayuk and Deebo Samuel, the 49ers wide receivers. For the Broncos wide receivers, Cortland Sutton and Jerry Jeudy. For the Steelers wide receivers, namely George Pickens. For the Green Bay Packers wide receivers, Christian Watson and Romeo Doubs. And then Amon-Ra St. Brown of the Detroit Lions. All of the guys that I just mentioned are still inside my top 36 wide receivers, outside of Jerry Jeudy and Romeo Doubs, who are just outside of that range. Keep in mind, too, that if you have an alternative option, maybe it makes sense to bench a guy like, Romeo Doubs or a guy like George Pickens. If you have a great option in a better matchup like a Gabriel Davis, for example, or a Zay Flowers, for example, maybe you want to leave those guys on your bench. But for the most part, they're just matchups. It's just one metric that we're looking at. Now we get to the tight end position. You guys can see some of the best options there, best matchups that we have. Of course, TJ Hawkinson for the Vikings is in a good spot, and he was in your lineup regardless, but definitely could be in a really good spot this week in a high-scoring game environment against a bad defense against fantasy tight ends. As far as streaming options, because I'm sure some of you guys are without David Njoku, or you're without whatever tight end is underperforming for you in your lineup, Zach Ertz is in a good spot. Luke Musgrave is in a good spot. He's also a good buy low candidate because he's eventually going to have a pretty good game here and there. And then Tyler Higbee, also a good streaming option. If those guys are available on your waivers and you have David Njoku on bye, or Pat Freiermuth is injured, or whatever the case is, you could probably pick those guys up and throw them right into your tight end spot. And then, of course, also, if you are totally desperate and none of the guys that I just mentioned are available, Tyler Conklin and Zach Wilson seem to have a good connection. The Broncos are dead last against fantasy tight ends. That one's a desperation play, but I do think he's a viable streaming option going up against the Broncos. And then some of the guys that you maybe want to leave on your bench this week at tight end, we have Cole Kmet, Pat Freiermuth, if he ends up even playing, Hunter Henry. You probably want to leave those guys on your bench if you can help it. And also make sure to temper expectations for Mark Andrews and for George Kittle. Although those guys are still in your lineup, you're definitely still going to start those guys. And then when it comes to defenses and kickers, if you guys still play in leagues with defenses and kickers, I haven't for a number of years. But if you do need a streaming defense this week, the Washington Commanders versus the Bears tonight will be a good option. The Detroit Lions versus the Carolina Panthers is a good option. The New York Jets versus the Denver Broncos is a good option. The Ravens versus the Steelers is a good option. The Packers versus the Raiders is a good option. So definitely keep that in mind. Again, if all else fails, just target a game with a low point total, potentially against a bad turnover-prone type of quarterback, and you should be okay. And then with kickers, obviously just target kickers in good offenses who project to be in high-scoring games. So if this helped you, if I helped you set your lineup, leave a like down below. If you want access to our weekly rankings, all of these matchup charts that I broke down in this video are available by signing up on Flock Fantasy. Use the promo code FSE when you sign up, and you'll get 30% off. If you sign up annually, you'll get a free Zoom consultation with myself, and we can talk about whatever you want to talk about, whether it's Dynasty, Redraft, Best Ball, whatever you want to talk about, we will talk about on that free Zoom consultation. And also, if you want this data for free and the weekly rankings and rest of season rankings for free, you can head on over to Underdog Fantasy, the official show sponsor of the Fantasy Stock Exchange. Use the promo code FSE when you sign up and make a $10 deposit, and you will get our rest of season rankings for free to help you guys out with trades, as well as our weekly rankings and all of these matchup charts and matchup information pieces for free by signing up on Underdog Fantasy. Within a day or two, you guys will receive an email with access to that stuff. So with that being said, if you guys enjoyed, like, subscribe, all that good stuff. Peace out, and we'll talk to you soon.